So today we'll begin our discussion of Islam, the third of the Abrahamic faiths. The global Muslim population numbers nearly 1.6 billion, though new studies come out regularly and researchers consistently make note of the difficulty of gathering an accurate count, especially in those global arenas where the Muslim population is most on the rise, which are generally low socioeconomic regions, and it means that the infrastructure just really isn't developed as it is in the so-called first world. So what we know is that the Muslim population is growing and that nearly 1 in 4 people on the planet adhere to Islam. Now, like Jews and Christians, Muslims worship the God of Abraham. They believe in God's revelations and prophets, and they place a really strong emphasis on moral responsibility and accountability. In this way, Islam is situated stably as what we have called an ethical monotheism. It's in that train. One thing to note off the bat is that Allah, the word that most of us know to be the God of the Muslim word, the word Allah is the Arabic word for God. So Arabic-speaking Christians also know their own God as Allah. It means God. So we'll talk in our closing lecture about the ways in which Islam has become known in the so-called West and how this historical development has helped to shape Western perceptions of Islam. To begin, though, and for the first few lectures, we'll look at Islam in its own terms. Today, we'll introduce the backstory. We'll talk a little bit about images in Islam because I'll be using them throughout these lectures, and they've become quite a hot topic in contemporary debate. And then we'll move on to take a look at the Arabian Peninsula at the time of Muhammad's birth. So as we've seen, Muslims believe in and revere the prophets of the Abrahamic God. Many of the characters that we've already seen reappear here, though the storyline is often a little different. So Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and others remain part of the Muslim faith experience. But for Muslims, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament were corrupted. They're not considered sacred texts because, through mistranslation or historical accident, the stories have been mistold. So the stories, as those texts present them, are not considered correct on a number of counts, and it's the Quran to which Muslims will turn for these narratives. Now, in the interest of time, I do want to mention these prophets, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about Jesus, who's known to the Muslim world most commonly as Isa. That's, again, just Arabic for Jesus. For Muslims, Jesus was a prophet and is honored as such. He's understood to be still alive in heaven, and he will return to battle the Antichrist, the deceiver, at the time of judgment, and he will win. That's the belief. He was in his life on earth a miracle worker, and he was born of a virgin. He affirmed the doctrine of resurrection by raising the dead during his own time on earth, and his central defining characteristic was compassion for the poor and the suffering. That's what's carried through into the Muslim understanding of Jesus most solidly. For Muslims, though, Isa, or Jesus, he wasn't divine. He was a man. He was not a son of God, and he did not die as a sacrifice for our sins. So that part of the story is different. He's a prophet who's understood to have predicted the coming of Muhammad. Now, all prophets in the Muslim world are monotheists, and for Muslims, every nation receives a warner, somebody who's been sent by God to give people a chance to bring people to the straight path. Every nation receives a prophet, a prophetic figure. And again, misunderstandings are part of life, and Islam sees that whatever in other religions adheres to the Quran is true. So everyone has a piece. But for Muslims, thanks to Muhammad, Muslims have a more complete and true picture. Muhammad is considered the seal of the prophets, the final prophet. He was chosen by Allah to bring the divine message to the people of the Arabian Peninsula and ultimately to the people of the world, and he entered into his prophetic mission at the moment depicted here, which has come to be known as the Night of Power and Excellence, when he was visited by the angel Gabriel and he received the first of many revelations. These revelations, taken together, are the text of the Quran, and we will get to that later. One thing to note is that when you see Muhammad's name written, it's often written with PBUH in parentheses after his name. So do you remember how, think back to the world of Judaism, and for Jews will often write the name of God like this, as a sign of respect, right? That you don't write the full name of God for all kinds of reasons that we discussed then. This is a similar move where from within the tradition, if you're going to write the name of Muhammad or even speak the name of Muhammad, you follow it with peace be upon him. And so you often see this PBUH, and I just want you to know what that means. But back to the storyline. So the image depicted here, this is Gabriel speaking to Muhammad, and Muhammad is receiving his first revelation, and we'll get to that narrative, the narrative of Muhammad himself, in the next lecture. But what I want to point out here is something that we'll also return to in the last lecture in more contemporary terms. I know. This is a painting from the 14th century that clearly depicts Muhammad along with the angel Gabriel. It was not the case for the majority of Muslim history from the 7th century CE until now, that depictions of the prophet were banned. It just wasn't the case. For most of Muslim history and for most Muslim jurists or folks who deal with the law, who articulate the law, such depictions were loved. They were honored. They were even encouraged, so long as they were reverent and respectful. The Muslims were always a little wary of how the Byzantine Christians treated art. Remember the Byzantine Christians, that Eastern Christianity where there were icons and there was veneration, and there was a lot of kissing of the images, and even the Western Christians looked at them and said, "Oh, that looks a lot like worship." Well, the Muslims, we'll see in the maps in a moment that the Muslim community was very early on in interaction with the Byzantine Christians or the Eastern Christians, and they were always just a little wary of how those Christians treated art. They were never okay with outright veneration, but the ban is recent, and it is not the majority position. Now, this is a detail from a frieze that appears on the interior north wall of the United States Supreme Court, the whole of which, if you see, you can see that this is a detail, but it is bigger. There are 18 figures depicted here, and the whole of which it depicts great lawmakers of history. These larger-than-life relief sculptures were designed in the 1930s as the courthouse itself was being built, and they remain there today. Muhammad appears with a sword and the Quran, and I recommend that you look into this because it's a really awesome piece, and especially that you take a look at the article mentioned here on the slide, published on January 19th of this year, 2015, in Newsweek and written by Christiane Gruber. This article does a really good job of recounting the history of imagistic representation in the Muslim world. But what I really just want to draw our attention to is that, yes, I will be using images of Muhammad throughout this series of lectures, and I don't do so in a kind of unaware state of the contemporary debate that's going on. I do know that it is a huge issue, but I just want to set the stage. This, within the Muslim world and its history as it's historically developed, this was okay, and we will see a lot of them. If we want to understand the history, we've got to look at what the Muslim world has done throughout that history, and imagistic representation has been a huge part of what they've done. And what do I mean when I say the Muslim world? Well, here, this is where it all began, the Arabian Peninsula, and this map shows the individual tribes that populated the peninsula at the time of Muhammad's life. And I show it here as a way to introduce the tribal humanism that governed the area in the 7th century CE. You don't need to remember all these tribal names, but you can see that there's many of them, and they sort of populate everything but the least fertile regions of this peninsula. So tribal humanism, some prefer humanistic tribalism, was a social structure centered around individual tribes, which were themselves made up of separate clans, which were in turn comprised of several families. These folks herded, they farmed, they traded, and they raided. Yathrib, which was later named Medina, it's not written here, so let me write it for you. Yathrib, later named Medina, was an agricultural center, while Mecca was a center of trade and commerce. Intertribal warfare was well established. It had a code, rules, guidelines. Courage, loyalty, bravery, and hospitality were the primary virtues. This reminds me, and it might remind some of you classicists in the house, of classical Greek culture, right? It's similar. This loyalty, bravery, hospitality, courage, these were the virtues, and the religion of the time reflected this tribal culture. So there were lots of local tribal deities who were objects of cultic rituals, such as sacrifice, pilgrimage, and prayer. The Kaaba, cube-shaped building in Mecca with which many of you will be visually familiar, and which we'll talk more about later, housed nearly 400 idols, little statuettes of these local deities. It was a central religious site to which people from all over Arabia came on pilgrimage, and which the Quraysh tribe had custodianship of. This custodianship had financial benefits as well as benefits of societal esteem. The Quraysh were rich and respected, and Muhammad was of the Quraysh, though he was himself a lesser member of the tribe, orphaned early and left under the care of his uncle. Again, we'll turn to Muhammad next time. But one final thing to note about the social and religious context before we turn to Muhammad himself is that among the polytheists, there were some known as Hanifs, who were monotheists that were neither Christian nor Jew, but were understood to be descendants of Abraham and his son Ishmael. So there were some folks who were kind of they were set up to be Muslims before Islam ever began. Now, all the while, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, which were the Persians, intermingled. Arabia was pressed, surrounded by the incredibly old, incredibly powerful Byzantine and Persian empires. And Arabia was at this time politically and economically impoverished relative to these empires around it. It had no centralized institutional government. Trade routes were expanding, but they were volatile. This was a land of nomadic people in a time of great socioeconomic change. The major cities were prospering and attracting people away from nomadic life and toward a more sedentary comfort. And this was a comfort for some. There was a new wealth in the settled market of the trade center of Mecca, and a commercial oligarchy began to develop in which the Quraysh played a major part. Oligarchy means rule by the rich. Now, these developments led to greater division between social classes, as you can imagine, a growing disparity between the rich and the poor. And all of this strained the traditional tribal values of the Arabian Peninsula. It's into this context that Muhammad is born, in 570 CE. Now, what this map shows that we're looking at is the location of the two major cities. Again, one is agricultural, the other commercial. But just a note here, Medina, again, was called Yathrib when Muhammad was born. It was renamed Medina, which is short for Madinat Rasul Allah, or City of the Prophet, after Muhammad's great migration there. At that time, incidentally, the city of Yathrib was primarily populated by Jews, many of whom converted to Islam with the arrival of Muhammad. But again, we'll get to that story later. So here we see, on the map, you see Medina, known as Yathrib when Muhammad was born. That was a city primarily Jewish, but agricultural. And then you see Mecca, which was the center of trade. Now, in the next lecture, we'll turn our attention to Muhammad. But in closing here, just take a look at this. This is a little bit of a time warp. We just jumped ahead. But this map shows the expansion of Islam after Muhammad's death. But what I want to draw your attention to here is the geographical and political context. At the time of Muhammad's birth, Arabia is pressed upon from the northeast by the Persian Empire and from the northwest by the Byzantine Empire. It is itself a small force. It's a backwater. And it is surrounded by rich and well-established forces. And what this map shows us is that just over 100 years after Muhammad's death, Islam has expanded all the way west to the Atlantic and to the east into and through Persia. And here's the Muslim world population today. Now, again, 1 in 4 people on the planet adheres to Islam. The expansion is astounding. It was fast, and it's considered by historians something of a miracle. I mean, this is what makes Muhammad one of the most celebrated figures in history. This expansion is unheard of for such a small force. The question that this expansion presses upon us is, how on earth could such a small force grow so large and so quickly? The beginning of the answer to that lies in the figure of Muhammad himself, and we'll turn to him in the next lecture.